Welcome, everybody, to the 19th episode of Art of Law. This episode is a little bit of a potpourri of topics. We're going to go through some, we're going to go through these rapid fire, I think, Mark. And just to give a little bit of housekeeping, this is, of course, one of our, one in a series of episodes based off of Mark's book, The Art of China, The Art of Law, chronicling 15 years of practicing in China. Well, at that point, but obviously much longer now. Everybody will get a copy of this presentation afterwards, and the link to our YouTube channel, which is why we're recording this, is you can watch this episode and all our previous episodes on the YouTube page. Lastly, this episode is Mythbuster style, so we're going to go through a variety of different myths that I kind of threw together. Mark doesn't really, some of them we've previously touched on, some of them are brand new. So Mark might not know the answers, might have a tough time here, but in this episode particularly, everybody, I have the chat box open. If you have any myths yourself that you would like to throw at Mark, just feel free and go ahead. But like we normally do, Mark, I like to start off with something a little bit of then and a little bit of now, because most of our viewers who are following this, but also some who are brand new. Mark lived in Shanghai for 30 years, something like that.
27. Not that old.
27 years. So we usually like to start off these episodes with a little bit of back then and a little bit of now. So my myth, my first one that obviously I needed to get out there. I've been here for a little bit myself. Number one, Mark, new Shanghai is better than old Shanghai. What do you think?
I think it's so obvious that new Shanghai is better than old Shanghai. But yeah, this is a personal thing. I remember talking to one of the partners in Beijing like a couple of years ago, and it's the partner who I know the longest. So I know her from back in 95, I think, 95, 96. And she was telling me in many ways China was better back then. And I just told her she was ridiculous. Back then I couldn't even buy a pair of shoes. And I haven't got big feet. I had to go to Nanjing because supposedly people have bigger feet in Nanjing. So I just don't think you can compare the two. Of course, it's much better now.
All right, so I got my pen here. We're going to say that this is confirmed. So, all right. And for all the folks at home playing along, some of these questions will have answers, but a lot of them also will have a little bit of Mark's opinion on them too. So we'll start slow, I think, Mark. Number two, business is better in Shanghai and Beijing compared to the other cities in Shanghai.
I would have preferred it was business is better in Shanghai or Beijing. Being a great hater of Beijing and a great lover of Shanghai, I would have preferred that question. So I'll answer that question instead. So I'll start with that question. So I think, because a lot of people do ask this. A guy just asked it like last week. Should I set up this company? It's an e-commerce platform. Should I set it up? Where should I set it up in China? And even today, even with the rise of Hangzhou in e-commerce or Shenzhen really booming, really comes down for most companies. Do I set up in Shanghai or Beijing? I think for most companies, if you are, targeting the consumer class, or it's like a mass business, or, you're not really tied into things, Shanghai is probably the best choice because when you come to visit, you're happier to visit. It's an easier city, I think, from a regulatory point of view. Beijing, I think, if you were like an insurance company or a bank or something banking might be different because you'd probably be in Lujia's way. But if you're something very regulated or you're really dealing with state-owned enterprises, then you probably go to Beijing. Now, if we're talking about, this thing about, really 90% of, companies always talking about Shanghai or Beijing, yeah, unless they have a real reason to go somewhere else. I think, if we look at joint ventures, they might go where there's their joint venture partner, where there's the raw material or something. But I think if you're looking, nowadays at China, I think still Shanghai is probably, if you're just like a company that is just wanting to start a business, like if you were a service as a software company or something like that, like a tech type company, I probably would still go for Shanghai or the surrounding area because I still think the human talent's better and things like that. But I think Shenzhen's a good place to set up. Hangzhou's a good place. Chengdu's a good place. So there's many options, but probably Shanghai's still the best. I mean, one thing that's complicated things a bit, I haven't checked it in the last few weeks, but if your business has expats, China's changing its income tax requirements. It used to be that housing allowance and children's education was, tax-free for the expats, but that seems to be changing. I think in the Greater Bay, like Shenzhen, a few of the cities down there, the government's going to reimburse those taxes. I don't know if Shanghai's agreed to do that or not. So that might also, play a role.
So I think, yeah, there's a lot of factors to consider. So I'm just going to put a little check mark next to plausible. I think that's the right one. All right, moving on. These are pretty rapid. So, I tried to keep them in somewhat of, one question leads to one myth leads to the next, but they're going to be a few bumps on the road. So just bear with us. I think it's a pretty fast-paced episode. Myth number 3, Mark. Woofies are the most common investment vehicle for international companies in China. What do you think?
I mean, for sure now, I'd say back in the 90s, most companies were joint ventures. Used to be quite a few rep offices. And then I think in the early 2000s, we saw many more woofies. And now I think, law firms, often people don't go to law firms for woofies unless they're in a restricted sector or there's an operational license issue. So if it's a trading woofie, I think most people go to a very, inexpensive corporate services firm or something to set those things up. So I'd be guessing, but I guess for every joint venture, there's probably like 5 woofies being established at the moment. But probably the more interesting companies are the joint ventures, and joint ventures are enjoying a bit of a comeback. I think, in the 2000s, mid 2000s, late 2000s, people were saying, the same people that are saying you could only do a joint venture were suddenly saying you could only do a woofie. But now I think we're seeing a lot more complexity. And I noticed in the audience today, Fred Chang's on there. And, Fred is also doing a business where he's trying to act as a bridge between, international tech companies looking to come to China. And I think very often that will be in joint ventures where, maybe they don't even share a brand name, but an international company that doesn't feel it has the bandwidth to deal with China, someone like Fred will play a role to help find a Chinese partner and really build a China business based on that tech. So I think we're seeing, more and more joint ventures, but I'm pretty sure it's still probably outnumbered 5 to 1 for woofies.
Was it historically this way, even 20 years ago?
Now, like I said, I think in the 1990s, it was mostly joint ventures. There were a few rep offices. There were more rep offices than woofies. I mean, rep offices aren't really an investment vehicle, but I'd say back then, because the only laws we had, and the laws are very limited, to be a woofie, it was about you had to be export orientated or super high tech or something from memory. And then I think what happened was in the late 90s, early 2000s, the local authorities kind of realized that foreign investment was good. Foreign investments was bringing jobs, money, business, tax. So they started encouraging woofies because, let's say a joint venture takes between a year and maybe 2 years to negotiate very often. A woofie can be done within a couple of months. So I think, even back in the 2000s, it was much more open than, in the late 90s or early 90s.
I think that's interesting that companies are.
The rep offices I think they've fallen off a cliff. I mean, you
Yeah.
rarely see, the only rep offices we see now are NGO rep offices or somebody who's in a very restricted area and just wants to keep an eye on things. But I don't see any company doing rep offices now. They'd rather do a trading company or a consulting company if they don't really know exactly what they want to do.
Yeah. Okay, so just to summarize this one, it seems that for most general businesses, WOFIs are still pretty much the prevalent investment vehicle. But it is interesting that joint ventures still play a role, considering the historical trend, because of more specific issues such as technology and partnering with maybe some strategic partnership. So there is a little bit of both. All right. What about number 4? So in setting up your company, one should consider setting up in the free trade zone. I think this one, maybe Mark, you can also give a little bit of twist because you've been practicing in China for so long. Free trade zones now, but also compared to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, how has that changed as well?
So I think, yeah. So I mean, I think again, like the free trade zone is still a big thing, but they've been very successful, but they're not as big a thing as they were, 15 years ago. So I can't remember when exactly. I think Waigao Chow might have set up in 2001 or something. I can't. It had its like 15th anniversary a few years ago. So the Waigao Chow in Shanghai was the first big bonded zone. So I think back then it was a bonded zone, not a free trade zone. And what really happened there was they were super successful early on. And one of the reasons was, strangely enough, it's very strange now that you think about it, but back then, one of the most regulated types of companies you could set up was a trading company. So a trading company was not only required to be a joint venture, but it had, special requisites. Except at the Waigao Chow back then, you could set up a trading company there, and the only requirement from memory was you had to have 140,000 US dollars investment, registered capital, had to pay it within 6 months, I think, and you needed a lease contract. So once people got used to that, of course now trading companies you can set up anywhere, but strange, I don't really even know why they were so restricted, these trading companies. But people set up, trading companies, and then there was all these kind of other niches. So we had a bunch of companies who set up after-sales service companies. Back then, in the early 2000s, that was also had to be a joint venture. But say if you were a company like MAN B&W, which would do these big diesel engines, you would set up your after-sales service, which is maintenance, repair, spare parts, etc. So that was a big business. And I think over time, the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, was always good at finding new things. So they're often a pilot zone. So I think they were a pilot zone for assembly, because you could bring in capital equipment and you could ship it out without having to pay customs duty and VAT if it was something which was very capital intensive. And then they started doing things like we had another client that brought in wine. We've got a client who's looking at jewelry at the moment because these are things where you can have a showroom. You don't have to pay customs and VAT unless you actually import it and sell it. But the free trade zone, we don't talk about also VATS licenses. They've got certain requirements. Hospitals were also, you could do it as a wholly foreign owned enterprise, not as a joint venture in the free trade zone. So they've always been a bit of a pilot project. I think now we see less people asking us about it. And also the free trade zone, the Shanghai one, was so successful, they ran out of space. And so, they actively tried to move the manufacturers out to places like Jiading and other places because they wanted to do more of the trading. So I think the free trade zone, it depends on what your business is. But if it's something like, high value, or it's something where you want to keep a stock of stuff, but also we did one once, which was repairing aircrafts, looking after aircraft maintenance. So I think it's not for everybody anymore. But if you've got that kind of business, it's a very important thing to think about.
If you have those types of business, is it one of those things where you would know if you would be eligible for a free trade zone, or is it something that if I'm just if I'm just one of just a retailer, for example, that I probably shouldn't even consider
No,
this?
you might not know, but it's really not for everybody. I mean, because being in the free trade zone, especially in the bonded area, is going to be much more expensive, inconvenient. So it's not something you would do just for fun. So I think unless there's a reason for it, you should do it. But if there is a reason, like that jewelry company, it's very interesting because they can have a showroom. They've got very expensive jewelry. The client can come, or customer can come, look at it, and if they buy it, then they can import it, pay the VAT, the customs duty, etc., etc. Yeah, that's useful. So I think if it's the right kind of business, even now, it's very, very useful. But if you're just a retailer, it would be unclear why you would set up a free trade zone.
Got it. I'm just gonna chalk it up to busted for for the majority of businesses. Number 5, and I put this one here because it kind of goes to the free trade zone thing. You mentioned before. I don't know if we mentioned it on Art of Law. Maybe we need a separate episode for this. But sometimes when clients do ask about free trade zone, because there is a special license that they can get because they're established in the free trade zone. But even beyond the free trade zone, sometimes people say, well, I can get the license here rather than there because it's available. So the myth here is if a business license is available, then it is attainable.
You mean like if it's legally possible to get, then you should be able to get it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is, early on, many years ago, I think the Chinese authorities, especially the local ones, they were more likely to be a bit naughty. So people would issue business licenses, especially the lower tier of the city, the more brave they were when it came to issuing licenses. And I remember one was a place in Zhejiang. The client wanted to do a joint venture to manufacture cars. And manufacturing cars is one of the most restrictive things back then. Had to be a joint venture with a Chinese partner, had to have at least 50%, et cetera, et cetera. But the local authority was going to be willing to issue this business license. But of course, it would never make any sense because there'd be 1,000 things that would go wrong. You wouldn't be able to get your cars registered. You couldn't sell the cars. There was like 1,000 things. You wouldn't get the approval to build the factory. There's just 1,000 things that can go wrong. So I think now what you see is business licenses will often have a list of what you can do, and then they'll often put at the end, subject to any special licenses or operational licenses you might need. And so I think there are trigger words that nowadays, the authorities will be nervous about putting in the business scope. But in addition, it's about operational licenses. And if you were thinking of this in relation to free trade zone, I guess the big thing about that is those VATS licenses, the value added telco services licenses. Some telco services licenses are pretty easy to get. Others are difficult, and you need to have certain registered capital, might be a provincial level, might be a national level. You need to have certain staff, but you can still get them if you've got it. But then there are the other ones which are possible on paper, but they've never issued. So, so I think that's the issue. You can't just look at the law and say, oh, the free trade zone says I can get this. You may be able to get it, but we know in practice you won't be able to get it. And so I think, that's something you have to check very carefully before you, invest in something or, shout it out too loud.
Yeah, so I'm going to check busted. So number 6, and this is, I think this is a concept that we really haven't delved into too much in Art of Law, so we probably need to have a separate episode about this as well. But when you set up your company, choosing your Chinese company's directors, board, and legal rep, all of these positions, are pretty similar to the way that you would choose back in your home country.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the home jurisdiction is. I mean, I think most Western countries don't really care who the company director or board or legal rep is, I guess. I know that there's some countries like Malaysia, which requires, I think, like 50-50 between Malaysians, and you might even have to, have a ethnic Malay, or in the Middle East, I think there's some places where you need to have a local board member. But I think China is, I mean, I know China doesn't care, you can, there are some restrictions, so the person has to be of certain age, can't have a criminal record, can't be mentally deficient or something. There are certain, very basic requirements. But I think, basically it's up to you, whoever you want to choose as your director, you can choose. There's no nationality requirement. There's no residency requirement. So it's quite liberal.
So I think, I think you're right. I think there is a little bit of truth to it. So I'm going to put a check mark next to confirmed. But some of the qualifications will probably be different than of your country. So I'm going to put a check mark next to buses. I'm going to straddle these two right here. All right. Now this one we have covered a little bit, Mark. 7. Western countries need Western managers in China. How do you feel about that?
I don't know if we've ever covered this. I don't know. Do you find the Western people particularly aggressive, Sean? It's an interesting image. I don't know.
I have a little bit of bias when I put this slide together.
He looks like he's going to bite the guy's head off.
You're my Western manager. This is how I see you.
Yeah, wow. I don't know. It's not easy to say. I think, I think it's not about whether the person's Western or not. I think almost all Chinese companies or foreign invested companies in China, they end up localizing the management, etc. And I think, even if people think somewhere like Shanghai is a very international city, let's face it, Shanghai as a percentage, there's no Western city in the world that has less foreigners than Shanghai. I mean, like, I think Shanghai is like 0.01% or something, like it's just nothing. Whereas, a place like, I think Zurich has 25-30%, foreigners living there. So, I think it's a bit different. So I think, now with COVID, I guess it must be even harder to find a Westerner. So I think what you probably need is, when you first set up in China, most companies I know that have been successful have had people that really know their company go to China to set it up. Because if you just hire someone locally and they don't really know your company, it's difficult to infuse that DNA. So whether that guy is a Westerner or she's a Chinese person who's been working in your company for a few years, I don't think that's the important thing. I think the important thing is to have somebody, very much at the initial stages at least, that can know your company, is involved with your management. So if there's an issue, they can pick up the phone, ask questions, and find a solution. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Very good, Mark. Very good.
Yeah, actually, very politically correct. It was incredible.
Yeah. So for the, I'm going to put a check mark next to busted here. So for the hardcore fans of Art of Law, we covered this in episode 2 a little bit. And there was a study in that, it was a very small part of that episode, but there was a study in there that said successful managers in China either tend to be super Western or super Chinese. So it was either it was either really familiar or something totally new. And I think if you wanted to check out that episode, it's on our YouTube channel. Episode 2 is the one where we cover that. And yeah, Mark, you were consistent with your answer, so good job on that.
I just saw that Jerome posted a question. Jerome is a Dutch previous intern who started this whole web chat, this webinar thing. So I just wanted to also have the opportunity to remind him that the Dutch lost heavily in the Euro finals. Not in the finals. They didn't get that far, but they got totally defeated. So I just thought I'd raise that right now.
You can watch that on YouTube too, probably. So, so the next myth 8, Mark.
Yeah.
No guanxi, no chance. And I think this is one of the things that we've tried to hammer over and over again. And I recently, was it yesterday, sent you another article on WeChat from the American Jabber where someone was talking about the importance of guanxi is to a successful business. Well, we don't need to underestimate, but Mark, I know your thoughts, but I'll just let you speak to this.
Well, yeah, I think I'm consistent on it, and I did find that Harvard business law book and put it on my bookshelf now, so I can reach for it. Look, I think the thing is, I don't think guanxi is a solution to everything, and but yeah, so often people talk about guanxi, and it's not really guanxi. If you've worked with somebody for 15 years or you're related to them by blood or something, you may have some guanxi, but just turning up for a couple of dinners or whatever, it's not really guanxi. And so I think, what I think I've said always consistently is guanxi is a little bit like Santa Claus. If you believe in it, it's real, but often when you need it, it's not there. So I think if we're talking about, having stakeholder management, it's very important. But if you're talking about it just somehow being this super easy, successful thing that you can set up a company and Mr. Zhang and he likes you and you got great guanxi, that's probably naive. Yeah. But I would say probably over the years I've changed a bit. I used to think it was just irrelevant or whatever, but now I think it's important. I'm not sure if it's more important than in the West, because I think you see in the West as well, it's all about relationship. You look at why do rich children do better? Yeah, it's not just the education. It's often the guanxi, like in America, rich kids have a lot of competition, but the rich kids' competition is other rich kids. It's difficult. So I think this is something in the way. I think it's a universal thing.
Interesting. This is a art of law first. Mark is starting to see both sides of the coin. So I'm going to put a check mark next to plausible. Your previous stance, I think, is, usually it's it is kind of like a magic trick, right? If you believe it's real, then it's real, but it's mostly just an illusion. But there is definitely, I agree with you though. I actually do agree with you. I think there is a little bit of truth behind it too.
I wouldn't believe anybody who would tell me they have great guanxi, because I just would think.
Yeah, I think what you say is making sure that you have good relations with your Chinese partner. Like I think that's what you really mean. It's not just a few dinners, but actual relationship building. Now I was reading the book, Mark, which I have right here.
You're reading a bookmark?
Yeah.
It's a very short thing to read, a bookmark.
I read a book for once, and I wonder, this book is pretty old by now, so I want to get your stance on this officially. Myth number 9, sure. Mooncakes are delicious.
I imagine the only thing I would have written is I imagine that Haagen-Dazs had brought out the ice cream mooncakes. Because did I mention the Haagen-Dazs ice cream mooncakes? Because I have yet to find somebody who actually enjoys eating mooncakes. And they always just would make people eat the salty duck egg mooncakes. And I really, in all those years, I've never seen somebody Chinese actually enjoy eating a mooncake. You know.
Have you have you given it as gifts to other people?
No, I don't dislike people. I used to give away we used to get from the office like up to a certain number of Haagen-Dazs mooncake vouchers to give to clients. And I got the minimum, and I thought the minimum was going to be like 1 or 2, but then they gave me 10. And then I found out like other people were getting like 50 or 60. And I don't think they had that many clients. They probably went on the street corner and were selling the vouchers because they were pretty pricey. But yeah, I've given away the Haagen-Dazs things, or I have given away mooncakes that people gave me, and I re-gifted them. But I don't know. Sean, you're more traditional than me. Have you met anyone that likes mooncakes?
Um, I wouldn't say I'm more traditional than you. I would say I'm more fatter than you. So I like mooncakes. I don't discriminate for snacks and cakes. If it has the word cake in it, I'm probably eating it. So I'm going to put an S here for confirmed from my side, and I'm going to put
Yeah.
an M here for Mark. You think mooncakes are busted, and
Why
I
couldn't you eat something that you would like? Like instead of eating that, why don't you just like buy something that you enjoy eating? But I guess we're getting too out of context.
yeah, that's I enjoy a good meal, whether it and unfortunately also a bad one. So um, myth number 10. I try to sprinkle a couple in to keep you on
Yeah.
your toes. Myth number 10: profit and capital repatriation. Oh, I messed up the spelling there. Is nearly impossible. This is something I
Yeah.
think comes up. This is something that comes up. I think we've been working together for quite some time. I think it used to come up quite often before, and probably still now as well.
Yeah. So I think So I think this is a big myth as well. So I think look the with profit, there was a couple of times over the years, just for a short period of time, where getting your profit out was a bit difficult, but just only for a short period of time when there was this foreign exchange squeeze. But I think for profits, as long as you've got the audited, report showing that you made a profit, you got a board resolution, you don't need any approvals. Just go to the bank, and if you show that you paid tax, they'll send the money out. We've never had anybody had issues. Like I said, there was a short period, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, where you needed to have your bank, and this was never published, but the local branch had to be foreign exchange balanced. So if you were in Zhejiang or Jiangsu or Shanghai, where there's a lot of exports, that was no problem. But if you were somewhere like, I don't know, Inner Mongolia, it might be more challenging. And there was also, I think it was a $5 million US threshold. If it was above 5 million, you might have to split it up into tranches to send it out. So I think that profit thing is clearly busted. The capital repatriation, if we're talking about registered capital, then in all the years we were doing it, we were only successful once. And we didn't try too often because we always told people it's almost impossible. But it's very hard to reduce your registered capital because it affects creditors' rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so mostly it will only be if you do a liquidation that you can get that capital out. So I think this one's a bit difficult. So capital repatriation is nearly impossible except for liquidation, but the profit or arm's length contracts, that's not a big issue.
Yeah, I think when I put this together, it's mostly just the during the regular course of business. I think most companies are worried about that part. So I'm going to put busted here, but like you said, there are some corner case scenarios, bankruptcy, liquidation, these types of things. But if your company is at that stage, then you're already going down a different path than most companies. One of the questions in the chat was about VIEs. And VIEs, I think maybe we spend a little bit of time on this one, Mark, especially with what's going on the news with some of the Chinese education companies and these types of things with respect to American markets. VIE structures are sound and foolproof. It's a tricky question. I kind of snuck it into the middle here, but I try to get you to warm up first. But maybe you can share your thoughts.
I don't think anyone's ever said they're sound and foolproof. I think that would be a big statement. I don't know, like a myth sounds like something that people talk about and believe. I think if anything, people are probably too tough on the VIE structures. So, I think, the VIE structure is just really basically you have a foreign investor who has all or part of their business. Normally it's a part of their business, requires an operational license or is in a restricted field. And so they'll set up a wholly foreign-owned enterprise to do, most of the business. And then they will have a VIE company, which is a variable interest enterprise, which is an accounting term. And so basically there's contractual relationships, and that VIE company is owned by some local Chinese person or entity. And so that's the structure. It's in the news at the moment because a lot of the tech companies, they used it because it was difficult for Chinese companies to go abroad, back in the day, probably still today. It's not that easy to go to NASDAQ.
Just to be clear,
Sorry?
Just to be clear, the first part you were talking about was using foreign companies using VIEs to enter into China. And the second part was about Chinese companies using VIEs to go abroad.
Yeah, but it's the same issue because what happened was Chinese companies wanted to go abroad to raise capital, and it was easier to go list on NASDAQ if it was a Cayman or a BVI entity or whatever. But by rolling that business into the Cayman or BVI, so they'd still have a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, they had the same problem because for the sensitive area, they, as a foreign company, were not able to operate it. So they would also have a VIE. So it's the same issue for them, but I think it's up in the news now because of that. I think, if we look at most of that experience is really with the foreign investors using the VIE to get around a certain issue. I think it's been less problematic than it has been for joint ventures to get around the same problem. So I think most of the VI structures we've seen have been relatively robust. They work, but the main issue is, do you set them up correctly and do you have the right shareholder? The ones which haven't worked failed very quickly. So that was normally where they would have the general manager run the VIE, and they always got very greedy very quick. And so before business started, the VIEs collapsed. But I think, I think, there's always going to be a bit of a gray issue with the VIE if you're talking about a foreign investor operating in China. But I can't really remember a crackdown. There are, of course, the potential for shareholder disputes, but you also have those shareholder disputes with a joint venture partner. So, yeah, I'm not convinced. I think it's really a bespoke issue. It's a question of, what kind of requirements the VIE, if you want to do like real-time internet mapping, the VIE structure is not going to help you either because, it's not like anybody's going to get that license easily. So I think it's a bespoke issue, but I would say, no one's ever said this, Sean, but I would say the normal myth is VI structures are unsound and foolhardy, and I think that would be wrong. So that would be how I would have, turned it on its head.
So I'm gonna put Husky here because I did phrase the question wrong, but yeah, I think that's a really interesting take, Mark, and I think it's one that's based in practice, which is good to hear because I think a lot of people are reading the news about this, and it's good to get some practical takes. This next one, number 12, is a bit of a throwback to our Star Exchange episode, and I just thought that it was a really cool fact, so we don't need to spend too much time here, but the Shanghai Stock Exchange and its Star Exchange, they rank third in the world for IPOs, only behind the NASDAQ and the New York Stock Exchange. What do you think?
Well, you seem so happy. I imagine it must be true.
Mark, it's busted. It's so it actually ranks first in the world with 233 IPOs. Yeah, I know. I thought it was really crazy too. And it was ranked first, and I think this was 2020, ranked first in the world. And second was NASDAQ, and third was actually Shenzhen. stock exchange, not even the New York Stock Exchange. And the reason I bring this up is because for the next myth, the Star Exchange is obviously kind of like China's NASDAQ market. So myth number 13, IP protection is the #1 brought up issue that you encounter, Mark, by new companies who are entering China.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think for tech companies, for sure, it's the #1 issue. But yeah, we had that e-commerce company just come in last week. They are more worried about operational licenses, how we can get that. If you're a retailer, I don't think you care too much, maybe about your brand. So IP is an issue, but it really depends on what kind of company you are, what you're trying to sell. So I think if you're a manufacturing company relying on tech, it's probably one of the first questions you raise. If you're a consulting company, not. If you're a law firm, not. You know, it really depends on the type of company, I think.
All right, so I'm going to put here plausible, but I'll be. What about if it is a tech company? I'm sorry if I missed that part. If it is a tech company, is IP usually the one, or is there usually a universal number, like general issue that companies from all walks of life kind of ask you first?
I just think I think it would be one of the issues, but it will be, you know, it'll be in the people. The issue is if a tech company lands with us, they've normally already made the decision that they want to go to China. And then it's off. Yeah, this is a bit strange how I'm explaining it, but this is just the truth. I think it's often more incumbent upon us to raise the issue of IP and how to register your rights. And it's surprising that a lot of tech companies haven't actually taken the steps to protect their IP, even though they care about it. But they don't, strangely enough, raise it with us at the first meeting. Normally, when they come to us, they've already kind of worked out they want to get into China, and we actually raise it to them. You know, they will be more talking about which city, you know, how much investment do we need, things like that. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it's a bit different actually in practice.
Leading into the next myth, trademarks registered overseas are enforceable in China.
I think no one's ever said this, surely. I can't imagine anybody said this. So I'd say that's very clearly not possible. But yeah, what's an interesting thing is the R, you know, that I don't know what it's called. It's got a special name, but the R in a circle, you have to be careful about using that if your trademark's not registered in China. Because we once had a client that had a multi-million renminbi fine because they were using that R, and the trademark was in the process of getting registered, but had not been registered, and they were done for unfair competition law. So, you know, so firstly, obviously, if you want to enforce your trademark in China, you're going to have to register it in China.
Yeah. Mark, I know I want to just go through the next few. We have a little bit left here and only about 15 minutes. Likewise, patents registered overseas are enforceable in China. I don't think anyone has ever said that as well, Mark.
Yeah. Oh, well, look, people have thought about it. I mean, remember there was an Israeli company once that, you know, wanted to use their patent in Israel, which we found that they had ripped off from an Italian company. And I mean, it was really such a basic patent. It was almost like they had claimed to invent fire or the wheel or something. It was, you know, very outdated. But they were very upset that they couldn't enforce their patent that was ripped off from an Italian company that probably ripped it off from a German company. I don't know. But I think actually with this is even more interesting in trademarks. If you've got a patent registered overseas, not only is it not enforceable in China, you have given the Chinese competitors free rein to copy it because there's no prohibition against reverse engineering in China. And if you've patented it, you can't claim that it's a trade secret. So the worst thing is to have an overseas patent and not patented in China.
Yeah. Speaking of ripping off Italians here, I think I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Italian noodles evolved from Chinese noodles. What do you think?
Geez, I wasn't expecting this, Sean. Probably true, I guess.
I like to know what the chat thinks too. If the chat can let me know what they think. I was expecting some heat from this one. So what do you think?
Yeah,
Mark?
no, I think, look, this one I think is, plausible. The one which I find a bit ridiculous is when they claim pizza, and I think it's because they base it on that breakfast that you get, the young bing. I don't believe that. I mean, I think pizza is Italian. I think that, although I don't know, I don't think I've ever seen an Italian dish with peas in it.
So I had to look it up myself and I got lost in, Google trying to figure out the answer. So I'll just read you my notes here. One of the more popular theories was published in, and I'm not joking, was published in the Macaroni Journal by the Association of Food Industries. It states that pasta was brought to Italy by Marco Polo via China, but Polo described Chinese noodles as being like, quote, lasagna, which implies he was possibly already familiar with the pasta-like food before going to China. Therefore, most food historians believe that Arabs, specifically from Libya, are to be credited for bringing pasta along with spinach, eggplant, and sugarcane to the Mediterranean basin. And it was brought into Italy during the Arab conquest of Sicily in the 9th century. So for all of the...
where did the Arabs get it from, Sean? Where did they get it from?
I didn't go that deep.
But I think the Chinese, they also claim soccer and tulips and all things. So there's many things which are, difficult to know who invented.
Thank you, Madeline, for the comment. I think she was on the right track there too. All right, so let's get through this. This just a break before the last stretch here. Myth 17. Chinese courts use a common law system.
I don't think anyone's ever thought this.
I think this.
You don't think this. So there's no precedent. They have a bunch of judges. I don't think they have juries either. So, but I think the main thing is it's more statute driven. Precedent has much lesser role. Yeah, compared to a long time ago, there's a few more judgments online and stuff like that. But it's not the same like judges making law like it is in the West.
I'm going to put busted here. The reason why I bring this up is mostly because for the next few questions here. So Chinese courts can enforce the judgments of overseas courts.
Yes, they can, but they don't want to, I think, is the answer. But who are these people with yellow T-shirts called enforcers? What are these people doing?
I was just looking up for enforcers. I couldn't find a Chinese judge enforcing a foreign judgment picture. So
well, it'd be hard to see how that photo would look like.
I'm going to put plausible here, but again, I think this echoes back to the whole, if a business license is legally attainable.
Well, I do have can I tell a quick story? Yeah. I think it's still one of the funniest stories ever. Was we got these legal opinions. We had to do legal opinions on these big shipping contracts. And our legal opinion was actually always very, very short. And, I got it given to me like 20 years ago, like a box, because somebody left and they said, oh, can you take care of it? Anyway, and the legal opinion was given in a format by big UK law firms. And anyway, all we had to really opine, of course, because it was, a template from a UK law firm, it was like 5 pages long. Yeah, you could have done it in 1 page. But really, all we had to say was, that English law was valid. Firstly, the contract, the Chinese party was existing. It was executed properly. That English and Welsh, the laws of England and Wales was a valid choice, and the enforcement clause, which was the courts of England, were a valid choice. And I got this, and the firm had been issuing these opinions for a long time. And it was, kind of true to say it's not invalid to say, the English courts can enforce these. But I felt very insecure about it because there was no judicial treaty. And under the civil procedure law, it just said the PRC courts have the discretion to enforce. And it's often based on reciprocity. And so I just tweaked the legal opinion to say, the PRC courts have a discretion whether to enforce, English judgment. Anyway, I was sweating a bit thinking this much. Anyway, life went on. We were doing these legal opinions every month or something for like 5 years. And then at this one UK law firm, because we were doing it for like 4 or 5 different law firms. And one of the law firms, a new senior associate, read the opinion and he phoned me up and he said, Mark, this provision in your legal opinion, it says that, the choice of the English courts is a valid choice, but enforcement through the PRC courts is at their discretion. Does that mean they can choose to do it or not? I said, well, that's how discretion works. And that got everybody very excited. So then they had to bring in arbitration clauses. But it just kind of shows you very often people don't think things through. So I think with contracts and things like that, it's important to think how you can enforce it, and these things. But that might be a different story.
No, I think that's good. I think when you told that story, it reminds me of the the VIE story that we just talked about a few minutes ago too. Myth number 19, Mark. Out of all the different types of compliance, cybersecurity is the most difficult to comply with.
Yeah. Again, hard to imagine this is a myth. It's hard to imagine it's such a broad topic.
Well, I think that's, especially what's going on with the news. That's why
you're talking about those guys. Yeah. Probably not difficult. You probably just have to go through the hoops. It's a bit uncertain. I think for most of our clients, it's not really an issue. Data's becoming much more difficult. Cross-border transfers is more difficult. You have to look at your business model. Stuff that you think might not be sensitive, like geographical mapping or something, may be very sensitive here or in China rather. So I think, is it most difficult? That's hard to imagine somebody would say that. But I think cybersecurity is a big issue. It's a legitimate issue. And if you're in a business that's dealing a lot with data, collecting a lot of information or using that information, especially if you're moving it overseas, you're going to have to be careful about it. But I think for most people, it's not so difficult to comply with.
All right. Going to have a few more, Mark, and then we have 8 minutes left. So let's just get through this. Myth number 20, when possible, don't rely on the standard Chinese contracts. You should use the foreign standard contract.
Yeah, I wouldn't use either. So I think, I think often the standard Chinese contracts are often too simple. The foreign standard contracts are just too complicated, too difficult. So I think, look, I'd say adjust it. For most of our clients, I almost feel by now, starting with the Chinese standard contract and bringing that up to, protect you is easier, especially for our American clients. I often don't understand their contracts and they do stuff which I don't understand. Like, if there's a provision that is going to annoy the Chinese counterpart, for some reason, the Americans decide to put it all in caps, underlined and in bold, just to really draw attention to it. So I think, I think it's not wise to use your contract. It's important. Yeah, your contract might say it's enforceable through the courts of New York or something, which we just discussed a minute ago. That's not really enforceable. So I think look at it and just think a bit about the contracts. A thing which I get upset about lately, I don't know why, but this adversarial approach. I think having contracts that are too one-sided just makes life too difficult. I think you should try and design a contract that both parties understand and try to find the middle landing point where it's likely. And then within that movement, and that used to be the case like 15 or 20 years ago, when we would have European companies coming here, their contracts were pretty balanced. There was only a little bit of room where it was a little bit more beneficial to them. But I think in the last few years, everything becomes so one-sided. It's very difficult to negotiate. So I don't know how that all happened, but that's how I would approach the contracts.
I wasn't expecting this 20 to be the one you got on your soapbox for, but okay, I am glad you did. Okay. All right. Myth 21, we don't need a Chinese name. Our customers know us by our English name.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think Chinese names are just more important for most people. I think I think there wouldn't be even one English name that a higher percentage of Chinese people would know than the Chinese name of something famous.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, of course, it'd be a Chinese name.
All right. Negotiating leases with Chinese landlords is time consuming and difficult.
This is a surprise. Look, I'm guessing, I don't know where this came from, but I'm guessing the thing is, it can be, depending on how you approach it, because we're talking about one-sided contracts. These are worse than the American contracts. So, yeah, very often, yeah, the worst are the Hong Kong landlords. They have the worst contracts in the world. Chinese landlord contracts will be either very one-sided and short, or very long and one-sided, because they got the template off a Hong Kong landlord. But anyway, you can make it very time consuming and difficult by trying to negotiate it, or you just contract with the one or two things and you just give in. Because I think really the dynamic of dealing with leases is whatever changes you can make are very limited. So yeah, that's, and one of the issues we have this one retail company, they never were able to get a lease contract signed because they had like 20 different people that had to sign on it. So anytime a good lease came, it was gone by the time they got to step 3.
Yeah, I think the advice that I've heard you and others in the firm mention is that, just like you said, it is very one-sided. And so the best from a strategic standpoint is just to pick on the two parts that really are important to you, and then just really try to hammer those, and hopefully they can give. But for the most part, yeah, these are template contracts that the landlords use with all their tenants. And I think this is the last one, Mark. Yeah, this is the last one. Selling via cross-border e-commerce. Oops. Avoids
Were you
many
drinking last night when you did this, Sean?
I was just too excited putting it together. Avoids many of China's business challenges. And I think, this one is kind of interesting to end on.
Yeah, well, I think, look, I think it's a myth. Yeah, look, I think cross-border e-commerce, it's a solution for, say, cosmetic companies. There's changes now with animal testing, but for cruelty-free brands, it was a way. For fashion companies, it was a way to test the market. But I think if you really look at it, very few people build a very big, successful business on Tmall Global. So I think those cosmetic companies are going to have to sell onshore, online, offline in China, be in Sephora, be in Watson's, be in #1 department store, be on Tmall, be on Little Red Book, be on JD. So I think it's okay to test the market, build a bit of awareness, but most people are very disappointed after a period of time, and it's not easy.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think using it as a way to test the market is more than acceptable. But looking for any type of significant growth, it has to come on shore at some point. All right, guys. I think that is the end of our Mythbusters. Mark, I think you did a pretty good job, and you've been consistent. We even had some additional insights from you. But actually, for the people watching, I will send a copy of this presentation to you. If you have any thoughts on if these general type episodes are what you think are useful, or if there are any specific issues that you think we should cover, I'd appreciate if you could respond to the email back with those thoughts as well. All right, well, thanks a lot, everybody. See you next time.